Morning, church. Do you find that interesting? A little bit of a crash course on consumerism and materialism, and the guys' drawings were pretty good. And so for those of you who missed out last week, as we shared last week, Carl started our series on consumerism, which is called Whole. And he touched on and kind of covered what was covered there in that video. So that was just to give you a quick recap. And I'll maybe just share one or two other things that Carl shared before we dive into what we're going to talk about today, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So last week as well, Carl gave us some definitions for consumerism. He said this: consumerism refers to an ethos or a philosophy, a worldview, whereby meaning is ascribed to an identity sought in consumption, in stuff, materialism, in acquiring. So meaning and identity is sought in stuff, acquiring stuff. That is the whole idea behind consumerism. It is a system of thinking, feeling, and acting wherein society's values, aspirations, and collective meaning are primarily defined in relation to commodities and value assigned accordingly. Consumption is not simply, or consumerism is not simply about consumption or affluence. It is more about attachment and meaning sought in and ascribed to consumption. If there's any words in here that I've said that you don't understand or don't know, tap the person next to you and ask them to explain. Okay. But this is just to give us a bit of a framework, a bit of an understanding in what we are saying when we use the word consumerism. We're not just talking about exchanging, buying things. All of us are consumers. Anyone a consumer here? Guilty? Put your hands up. Everyone should be. All of us are consumers. We have to be. To survive, we have to consume. But consumerism is the worldview or the ideology that we buy into, where we attach our meaning, our identity to that acquisition and to stuff that we buy. That is the whole consumerism mentality. So in our discussion, we use materialism and consumerism interchangeably. They both speak to similar ideas. The video you watched there was by American psychologist Tim Kasser, and he says this as well. He notes that 98% of people in Western societies have a materialistic value orientation. That's huge. 98% of us living in Western society have a materialistic value orientation. And then the interesting thing, and this is what we might not like to realize or might not like to believe, but even amongst those who claim to be followers of Jesus, followers of Christ, who claim to follow after his worldview and that system of belief, George Barna, in his research on Christianity in the Western world, has discovered that our value systems very closely mirror those of the world around us. And here's what consumerism says. Here's the formula for consumerism. Time equals money equals things equals happiness. What I do with my time, I pursue money. Why? Because I want to get more stuff. I want to buy more things. And I believe this is the whole view of consumerism that we're talking about. And I believe that that is what is going to make me happy. That is what is going to bring me meaning. That is what is going to be fulfilling. Carl, when he closed off last week, he gave us a challenge. He said, why don't you go and spend some quiet time, spend some solitude with God. Take that time that we see up there and don't spend it on just making money. Take that time and invest it in a relationship with God. And if you struggle with that, then maybe it's because you've bought into this formula that we see up on the board. I did that a bit this week. I paused at some points and reflected on this whole consumerism idea. Because if I have to be honest, if I have to evaluate my life, I have to admit that in many ways I have bought into this whole way of thinking. How many of you reflected on it this week? Okay. particularly I noticed how much we've bought into this because recently we've moved, okay? And when you move, what do you have to do? You have to pack up all your stuff. Interestingly enough, Liz and I have been in the house where we've moved to now, and this is a bit embarrassing. Sorry, babe, I should have mentioned this beforehand, but we're going to confess, we haven't fully unpacked all our stuff. And we've been in this house where we've been living now for a few months, okay? And one friend who was visiting in our house last night, he actually said, well, doesn't that mean if you haven't unpacked it, you don't need it? You don't need it. And there's still there's a garage and another bedroom in our house that is still filled with stuff that we have been living and doing very well, maybe not very well, but we've been doing well without. And in reflecting, you realize maybe, just maybe, I too have bought into this whole consumeristic worldview and mindset that I think I've got to try and accumulate and acquire all this stuff. One mentor who I was watching and listening to on this very idea, he posed a challenge, and I want to maybe throw it out there to any of you. Do any of you have something, can you think of something that you have that you will not lend to a friend or to family members? Think of something that you have that if a family member or friend were to come to you and say, hey, Bridget, can I lend this? You'd be like, no, don't really want you to. Can you think of something like that? What does that mean? What does that say? Could it mean that we value the thing, the object, more than relationship? The mentor who I was listening to, he goes further and he says he does not buy anything that he will not be able to lend out. He does not buy anything that he feels he will not be able to lend. If he's buying that thing and he says, and he asks himself the question, will I struggle to lend this out? Then he feels that's the red light for him. He's like, nah. And so I've determined to do the same. This doesn't mean you can all come and ask me for stuff now. But is there something you have that you would struggle to lend to family or friends if they were to ask you? And we really know we're in trouble. You really know you're in trouble. And I'm going to speak to the guys here. You really know you're in trouble when there's that thing that has been sitting in your garage for ages. You've hardly ever used it. Let's call it a motorbike or whatever it may be. You've hardly ever used it. It's been sitting there for so long. And your wife comes to you and she's like, honey, we've kind of run out of food for the kids. I think we might have to sell the motorbike. And you pause. Then we really know that there's something wrong. How do you relate to stuff? Today our focus is going to be on how consumerism impacts relationships. How consumerism impacts relationships. To make sense of this, we're going to go through a few different steps. I want us to first zero in on what fuels, what lies behind consumerism that makes it so pervasive, that makes it so bad. What is behind it? I want us to then look at or try and understand the pull and the allure of consumerism. Then we're going to look at its effects on us and especially the effects what it has on relationships. And then we'll try and address what now, where to from here. So I want to start off by a quote. It's a quote by, and I'm going to get this guy's name wrong. His name is Alexis de Tocqueville. Any French speakers here? Alexis, we'll call him Alexis. He was a political and social commentator way back in the 1830s from France. And he went over to America to observe this new democracy. You know, America had started up way over on the other side of the world. Europe and the rest of the known world was on this side. And he went over to right back to Europe and observe this new democracy and share what he was seeing and what he was discovering. And he wrote something very interesting. He says this: our being restless in the midst of abundance. He observed a people who were restless in the midst of abundance. And he said, this spectacle is as old as the world. All that is new is to see a whole people performing it. Restlessness in abundance. Consumerism. Restlessness in abundance. This is something as old as the world we know. And why do you think he says that? I want you to turn to Genesis chapter 3. We're going to go right back to the book of beginnings. This is the first book in your Bible. It's on page 4 of the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. I'm not going to have the verses up on the screen, so if you can, reach for a Bible that's in the seat pocket in front of you. It's on page 4. Just a bit of background. This is the story of beginnings that we find in our Bible. This is the story of how man came about, and this is the story of why we find the world that we are living in, how the world came to be, the world that we find ourselves in. And it's kind of a narrative and explanation on our human condition and why we find ourselves in the situation that we are. So it starts off in Genesis chapter 1 with the creation of the world. Genesis chapter 2, sort of the creation, a bit of an extended creation story, the creation of man. And now Genesis chapter 3, this chapter is often known as the fall, or where man fell into sin. And we'll start from verse 1. Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. The serpent was the shrewdest of all the wild animals the Lord God had made. One day he asked the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from the fruit from Did God really say you must not eat the fruit from any of the trees in the garden?" "Of course we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden," the woman replied. "It's only the fruit from the tree in the middle of the garden that we are not allowed to eat," God said. "You must not eat of it or even touch it. If you do, you will die." "You won't die," the serpent replied to the woman. "God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat it, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil." The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruit looked delicious, and she wanted the wisdom it would give her. So she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. At that moment, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. When the cool evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking about in the garden. So they hid from the Lord God among the trees. Just to give you a little bit of... So Eve finds herself there talking to the serpent. The serpent, it says, is the wisest, or the wisest of all the creatures that God had made, or the shrewdest. And God had told Adam and Eve right in the beginning when he created them, he said, "You may eat from any tree in the garden. You may eat from every tree in the garden. Please just do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that I'll place in the middle of the garden. Please do not eat of that one tree." And this is where the serpent comes in verse 1, where he says, when he spoke to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from the fruit of any of the trees in the garden?" Here's the first thing that we find about this whole idea of what lies behind consumerism. What gives it its fuel? What is And right here, the serpent, when he's talking to the woman, sows a seed of doubt, plants a seed of mistrust, questions what the woman had heard God say. And I don't know if you noticed, but initially he misrepresents it at first. He says, God said you may not eat of any of the trees in the garden. And the woman corrects him and she tells him the truth, what God said. No. She said, God said we may eat of every tree in the garden except the one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, many have asked the question, why did God place one tree in the middle of the garden that Adam and Eve were not allowed to eat from? Why did he do that? Why did he say you can have of everything else but just this one? Wasn't he setting them up for failure? Wasn't he setting them up to be tripped up by this reality? See, what I believe about it and what the Bible teaches about is that the truer reality is that God knew human nature. God knew and understood us as human beings. He created us as human beings. And as created beings, He created us to worship. He created us with this desire in our hearts for something greater than ourselves. He created us with this desire to trust or reach for a bigger and a greater reality, to search for a greater meaning. That's why we have this title, Whole, the search for meaning. And then He told them and He explained to the first human beings that He, God, is that greater meaning. He, God, is that greater reality. That we in our human nature were created to worship, yes, but ultimately, in its truest expression, created to worship God. But God also wanted to create human beings free with a choice. Free to be able to choose to worship Him, otherwise that worship wouldn't be genuine. Free to be able to choose to love, otherwise any love or relationship wouldn't be sincere. And so this is why He placed a tree in the middle of the garden, which is one thing that they were not allowed to touch. Because this would help exercise that trust, that faith, that dependence on God. This would help man as he was created, help remind him that he is not God. He is not the one who created everything. No. There was a creator who is more powerful, who is greater, and who deserves our praise and our worship. That is why God placed the tree in the middle of the garden. Here's another reason why, and often people don't like hearing this. God created, and the Bible teaches, God created humanity free. Often we think of freedom as being free from restraints, free from any kind of restriction, free from any kind of boundaries. But how do we as human beings operate best? Sociologists, scientists, everyone who comments on the human condition will tell you that human beings operate best within boundaries, within restraints. This is why we have laws in society. This is why parents give. This is why kids feel so much safer when they're living in a home where there's restraints, where there's boundaries. And God understood and knew this about us as human beings and how He created us, that He gave us a restraint. And the truest way to live out our freedom was to live within that boundary and that restraint that God had given. That's why He placed a tree in the middle of the garden. And so the serpent, trying to sow the seed of mistrust and doubt, questions the woman and says, did God really say you mustn't eat from any of the trees in the garden? She corrects him and says, no, God said we may, just not of that tree. Then he carries on with his seeds of mistrust and he says, the reason why God doesn't want you to eat of that fruit is because He knows that when you do, verse 4, He says, you won't die. The serpent replied to the woman, God knows that your eyes will be open, and as soon as you eat it, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Immediately now, the mistrust is starting to brew, is starting to gender in the woman's heart. Where now the serpent is saying, no. Whatever God did, He didn't do for your best interest. Whatever God did, He didn't do out of love for you as a human being. Whatever God did, He did because He wants to protect His power. Whatever God did, He did because He wants to keep you back. He wants to hold you down. That restriction that you see that is in the middle of the garden, that is God trying to keep you down. If you eat of it, you won't die, and you will be like God. You will become a God. What is interesting about these promises, what is interesting about what the serpent says, is the serpent here promises what he cannot deliver. He promises what he cannot give. He promises something that he doesn't even have himself. He is not God, and he doesn't have life in himself. And so here and this is the thing about temptation and what I'm ultimately saying about consumerism as well, and I'll show you how it plays out in consumerism, is that it promises what it cannot give. And that false reality, that false idea of what is true, what is real, often resonates in our human hearts because we have that yearning, that desire to worship. And so we chase after that. Two things the serpent said. You won't die, which is ultimately saying you have life in yourself. You are the determiner of life, not God. And two, you will be like God. You have deity. You are God. The verse carries on. The woman looks at the fruit. What does she notice about it? This is in verse 6. The woman was convinced. She saw that the tree was beautiful and its fruits looked delicious. She wanted the wisdom it would give her, so she took some of the fruit and ate it. Then she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it too. The woman looks at the fruit, and it appeals to her appetites. She looks at the fruit and she sees the fruit looks good for food. She looks at the fruit and she sees, yep, it looks good for gaining wisdom, and everything that the serpent seems to be saying seems to be right. And here is the moment that is crossed where she chooses to believe what the serpent says, as opposed to what God had told her, as opposed to what God had given her. And Paul in Romans 1 verse 25, he comments on this. He comments on this saying, they traded the truth about God for a lie. So they worshipped and served the things God created instead of the Creator himself, who is worthy of eternal praise. Instead of turning to God for their meaning, instead of turning to God for their understanding about how to live, instead of turning to God for instructions and reality about life, instead of turning to the Creator, they turned to created things to try and find meaning and purpose. They turned to stuff to try and fill the void, the gap that each and every one of us has in our lives that we call that yearning to worship. They turn to stuff to try and find that meaning and that purpose. What we notice as well is that the way the serpent is able to do this is he appeals to the woman's, or this fruit, as she looks at it, it appeals to her appetites. Each and every one of us are created with appetites. That is the way God created us as human beings. We're created with appetites, and these appetites often keep us alive. You know, if we never went hungry, we might not eat, and then we might die. If we never had a yearning for success or whatever it may be, an appetite for success, we'd never work hard and achieve things. If we never had an appetite for whatever it may be, things could be hard for us as human beings. And so God created us with these appetites, but often these appetites are engaged through our senses, through what we see, through what we hear, through what we smell, through what we taste, through what we touch. And we see this happening here as the serpent says, or as the woman says, she looked at the fruit and it was pleasing to the eye. It was good for food. And she thought it would be good for gaining wisdom. And so she took and she ate. There's an interesting thing about appetites, is that we see from this moment, after Adam and Eve took the fruit and ate it, sin distorted human appetites. God made them for good. Sin distorted them, and consumerism exploits them. Consumerism tries to exploit every appetite we have to try and get us to buy more, get more, consume more. And we see this happening right here in the beginning in the Garden of Eden. There's a principle that often we miss and often we don't truly engage in life, and that is that either you will control your appetites, or by God's grace and through His strength, you will control your appetites. Either they will control you or you will control them. Many people who struggle with this whole consumeristic philosophy, many people who struggle with relationships, many people who struggle in their professional world to actually meaningfully engage and make a difference, many people who struggle in life or get to that point in life and they ask themselves the question, how did I get here? How did the choices I made, how did it lead me to here? I actually believe this, or I profess to be a follower of Christ, or I'm striving for this, but I find myself where I never wanted to be or where I never intended to be. Often haven't paid good attention to this principle, that either you will control your appetites or they will control you. And consumerism tries to exploit that very thing. Verse 7, at that moment their eyes were opened and they suddenly felt shame and nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. Do you see what's happened? What did this interaction promise? What did He promise them? You will not die and you will be God. You will experience a greater reality than you could ever imagine. But what did it actually give? Nakedness and shame. And this is the problem with all temptation. But this is ultimately what lies behind consumerism as well. It promises what it cannot give. There is an ad, and I just wanted to show you, give you an example of this. Many of you might have seen it, and I don't know if you need to go back to it, Doug. There we go. We see these advertisements all the time, everywhere, and I don't know if you ever see any of them on TV. So many of them speak to this reality. When you look at this ad, it's advertising Rolex, the watch. And it gives there, you wouldn't be able to read it, but it gives a short little description about the achievements, the excellence, the glamour and the fame that comes with being a star like David Beckham. And of course, David Beckham wears a Rolex watch. And ultimately, this kind of advertising, what it promises, it says, you know what? If you purchase, if you get more stuff, if you buy this commodity, then that reality that is David Beckham's could be yours. That reality could be your experience. It promises. But all of us know David Beckham got to where he was not by buying a Rolex watch. He got there by the talents and gifts that God gave him. He got there by hard work and determination. He got there by committing to something and sticking at it for a long time. He got there by perseverance. And so it's just an example of how in this whole consumeristic culture, it leverages this whole idea of promising what it cannot give and then ultimately leaving the person that engages with it unfulfilled, unsatisfied. And where we think this is what's going to bring us happiness, we get to the end of the road and realize it's left me more empty than I was before. But then it picks up there and it says, well, maybe it's because I didn't buy enough. Maybe it's because I didn't buy the right thing. And so we continue that cycle. We continue that dependence. And maybe for many of us, if we've been trapped in this, then U2's song is our anthem. Maybe even if you're Christian, I don't know if any of you had the chance to read the words for U2's song. His song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. How many of you know that? I still haven't found what I'm looking for. In the different stanzas, he goes through the different things where he searched. He searched in relationships. He searched in the dark side. He searched everywhere. And then in this one, and I guess this one speaks to us as professed followers of Christ, he says, I believe when the kingdom comes, then all the colors will bleed into one. But yes, I'm still running. You broke the bonds. You loosed the chains. You carried the cross. Who's he referencing? Of my shame, of my shame. You know I believe it, but I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Behind consumerism, at the heart of the matter, is a misplaced trust, misplaced worship, and searching for meaning through acquiring stuff. We ended in verse 8. When in the cool of the evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord walking in the garden. So they hid from the Lord among the trees. Then the Lord God called to them, where are you? Where are you? You see, one of the greatest tragedies of consumerism is the loss of relationship. The loss of relationship with God and the loss of relationship with man. And here's how that works. Full-blown consumerism seeks only to satisfy the demands or wishes of the consumer. Full-blown consumerism seeks only to satisfy the demands or wishes of the consumer. And so the consumer becomes the ultimate master of reality, of necessity, and of morality, often with little or no regard for what or whom is being consumed. Consumerism always asks, what is in it for me? What is in it for me? Selfishness, self-satisfaction, self-obsession are the byproducts of a consumerist mentality. As a result, what we observe in Western societies, if we were to look and see how has this impacted us in Western society when it comes to relationships, what we find is rampant individualism. So much of our choices these days in our culture, in our times, are not based on what is the best for our community, what is the best for my family, what is the best for my children. Rather, the choices and decisions are based around what is best for me. We act as though we are individuals standing alone, and whatever choices we make have no impact or influence on anyone else but ourselves. when in reality it's the exact opposite to what we think. All of our choices, everything we do has an impact on people around us, whether we like to see it, believe it, or not. The effects of consumerism on our Western society is individualism. And individualism destroys community. Another aspect that we see evidenced by the consumerism is that everything or everyone becomes a commodity. Everything is commodified. What does that mean? Everything around us we see and we try and use to make a profit, or we try and leverage to gain us some kind of prestige or some kind of success, or advance us in our quest to become more famous, more rich, or more popular, whatever it may be. Everything around us is commodified. Stephen's going to talk to us next week about how that has impacted religion. These days we've commodified religion. We've commodified water. People now take water from the ground, bottle it, and sell it to us, and we buy it. People have commodified the air. We now pay for our clean air. It's called carbon tax. Everything around us has been commodified. And the sad reality is we commodify people as well. How we interact with others, everyone around me is there for what they can benefit me. This is why when we look at our world and we see what are seemingly outrageous injustices like the sex trade industry, how has it come about? How is it tolerated? It's this whole idea of commodifying. That person is just seen as an object or something that can gain or I can use to get me a profit. The sad reality is that it happens to all of our relationships in some way or another. Commodities are objects to be used, separate from feelings, easily discarded. If I don't like it, I can get rid of it, and easily upgradable. If I want a new one, I just get rid of the old and upgrade. We commodify everything. Also, what we find is that our relationships are primarily networks, not meaningful, deep relationships where we actually get intimate with people or we actually engage in meaningful friendships, but rather the networks we have. And often we see those networks as friendships we can leverage, friendships we can use. We heard someone express this week in something we were watching as a staff. Never use your friendships. Never use your friendships. Friendships are sacred things. God may use your friendships, but you never use your friendships. And the other thing, consumerism's impact on relationships is the lack of commitment. And we see this not only with marriage relationships, we see this not only in families and parents, for whatever reason, leaving children. But we see this also in people's relationships to institutions, to churches, to work, to whatever it may be, a lack of commitment. I can easily move on. I can easily pass on. I don't have to spend any time or energy investing in anything anymore. I've become a consumer. All I'm interested in is asking the question, what can I get from this? How can I gain from this? And the irony is that we believe that is what is going to make us happy. When more and more, and as that video pointed out, more and more we find this generation dependent on medication, this generation more isolated and lonely, this generation more suicidal and depressed. Restlessness in abundance. The beautiful thing is that the Bible doesn't leave us there. And I certainly don't want to leave us there today. Rather, the Bible gives us a remedy. The Bible tries to adjust our worldview and calls us back to what God's ideal was, for what God's purpose was for us and for community. And I want to read to you the words of Jesus in John chapter 15, John chapter 15, verse 19 to 17, and he says this. This is page 648 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. It says, I've loved you, talking to his disciples. I've loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I've told you these things so that you may be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. I don't know if any of you heard that. I've told you these things so you may remain in my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. We're searching for that meaning, and Jesus is saying, here's where you find it. Verse 13, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. Verse 15, I no longer call you slaves. No, you are my friends. Since I've told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce lasting fruit so that the Father will give you whatever you ask using my name. This is my command. Love each other. See, consumerism directly attacks what Jesus declared is the greatest commandments: love for God and love for others. Jesus' command is love life. And I want to just quickly refer to 1 Corinthians 13 verse 4 as we close. 1 Corinthians 13 verse 4, and this is, you can see there on page 691 in the Bible in the seat pocket in front of you. And this is Paul, where he's describing this kind of love. When Jesus says, remain in my love, this is where you'll experience joy. This is where you'll find that meaning and purpose. My purpose and plan for your life. It's in loving one another. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4 to 7. Here's how he describes that love. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable. And it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up. Love never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Quickly taking stock. How many of you look at that and you're like, yep, I can put my name there, that is me. I am patient. I'm kind. I'm glad I don't see any hands, because this is a challenging reality for us. If this is the kind of love that God is calling us to, how can any of us live it out? We know that when we see this, we yearn for it, we long for it, and our hearts desire it, but we know that it is so far from the reality that we all live. The reason is, this is the love that Jesus lived out. This is the love that he came and demonstrated, and he says, you know what? If you will allow me to come into your life, if you will allow me to be Lord of your life, if you will organize and direct your life around these simple restrictions that I've given so you can experience the freedom that I want you to experience. If you will allow me into your life, then this love can live in you, can live through you, and will be experienced by those around you. So we have a verse for our series, and this verse is to try help us live out this reality. This verse is to try reshape our thinking about who we are and how we are to live, and not be so easily caught into this consumeristic mindset. And that is Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. And I'm going to ask you to stand with me this morning as we read this out together. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Please stand with me as we read this. We're going to do this every week of our series because we believe as we live this out, this is what will help and guard us against the challenges of consumerism. So let's read together Romans chapter 12, verse 1 to 2. So here's what I want. I want you to do, God helping you, take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Your take home for this week, how I want you to practically apply this is using the words of John F. Kennedy in his inauguration speech when he was announced as president. He said this, challenging all of America, and I want to challenge you with these words this morning. Ask not. Remember what consumerism asks? What's in it for me? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Ask not what your city can do for you. Ask what you can do for your city. Ask not what God can do for you. Ask what you can do for God. Ask not what your church can do for you. Ask what you can do for your church. Kids, ask not what your school can do for you. Ask what you can do for your school. Ask not what your parents can do for you. Ask what you can do for your parents. Ask not what your partner can do for you. Ask what you can do for your partner. Ask not what your neighbor can do for you. Ask what you can do for your neighbor. Imagine, church, imagine a community that lived that anti-consumerism mindset. Imagine a community that didn't only ask what is in it for me, but actually considered others and actually lived out the reality of love that Jesus lived out when He was here on earth. Imagine if the formula we directed our lives by was not time equals money equals stuff equals happiness, but time equals people